Okay, good morning. Welcome to Black Comic Book History Month. I'm Matt Staples. Over the next hour or so, I'll be taking you through 100 years of comic books with a particular focus on the black writers, black artists that helped create them, and the black characters that were created along the way. Over the next, we're basically just going to be talking about the history of these people. We're going to be taking the snapshots of history itself on a decade-by-decade basis, and we're just going to be generally looking over the trends that happen, so how things generally tend to start, and how it's evolved over time to the present day. So, a few quick things before we get started. So the focus on this is mainly going to be on American comics. It's the type of comics that most people are familiar with. So mostly the superhero comic line, the Marvel comics, the DC comics, and a few of the indie comics there. As much as I'd love to go through things like the British comics, European comics, and even the blossoming African comic industry that's currently happening, there's simply too much to cover to be able to cover it all in such a short space of time. So, also, a content warning. There is going to be racially insensitive imagery during this presentation, especially during the early decades. So we're going to be seeing depictions of how black people were drawn during those times. It is unfortunately very racist. We're all just going to have to get through it together, I'm afraid. There's also going to be use of the term Negro in a positive historical context. Before the 1960s, Negro was the preferred term to be used, as far as I understand. And a lot of the works that were created by black people were using this term over the term black. So you're going to be seeing terms like the Negro race being used here. This little here is a quote from the black philosopher Dubois being quoted by the character Rocket in the comic Icon. We'll just be using that term throughout, so yeah. Finally, questions. If you've got questions, the last 10 minutes of the presentation are going to be focusing on question time. So if you've got anything, just put it in either the chat box or the Q&A. I'll be looking at those at the end and trying to answer what questions I can. Right, with that, let's get started. So when I first began setting this presentation up, my first idea was I'll get some first appearances. Comics love their first appearances. First appearance of this character, which issue they first showed up in, and the like, and I figured that'd be a good thing. I'll see if I can get the first black superhero character. What I discovered was a bit of a rabbit hole, because the further I looked into it, you realize there's lots of different ways people determine what's the first. So there's the first superhero, there's the first regular hero without superpowers, there's the first character. There was also problems in defining what a comic book is even considered, because there's comic books, there's comic strips, there's newspaper single panels. You could even go so far back to say 14th century Japanese woodblocks are considered a form of comic book. I decided not to go back that far, but I basically did a lot of hunting down in order to try and find out what was the first depiction of a black character in a comic book. And after much researching on the internet and the like, I basically found it to be this particular comic here. This is Hogan's Alley from 1896, a newspaper panel strip depicting the adventures of the Yellow Kid, which dealt with political issues that were occurring at the time. This here comic is depicting the rising tensions that were going on between America and Spain during the Spanish Civil War and disputes over Cuba. And in the middle here, we see one of our first depicted black characters, this little guy here. And right from the start, we can kind of see where the trends start. We see the large red lips. We see what's kind of seeming to be depicted as low intelligence. We see poor spelling here, down with England, they don't know what they're up against. It's a very negative depiction from what we're used to now, but this was pretty much the norm at the time, and it continued like this for at least a few decades. Moving on, we have the first depiction of the first black named character. This would be Loughborough from the comic Mandrake the Magician. Mandrake, if you're not familiar with him, you're probably a bit more familiar with one of his allies, Flash Gordon. Mandrake was simply magician, and Loughborough was his assistant. And we see here another one of the most commonly depicted ways of showing black people in comics back in the 1930s. A basically dumb brute with low intelligence, unable to realize he's been hit over the head with a 2x4. Usually depicted in an exotic jungle vibe, with some kind of tribal manner, with connections to things like mysticism and voodoo and the like. Another type of character we'd often be seeing early on would be, as we can see here with the first black kid sidekick, Ebony White, the comedic sidekick character, usually presented again as being more frightened, scared type, always cracking jokes, usually being unaware of the danger they were in. Again, kind of considered normal. Ebony White here, you also get the bad names that you get with them. Ebony is actually probably one of the fairer depictions, which is bad to say. He came from the comic known as The Spirit by Will Eisner, and in it there was more of a comedic partnership between him and the main detective, The Spirit. So he's actually presented a bit more fairly. For a character who wasn't presented as fairly, you had Whitewash Jones from The Young Allies. The Young Allies was a series of comic books which followed the adventures of Bucky. Bucky was the sidekick to Captain America, who would later become the Winter Soldier, if you're familiar with him in the cinematic universe. Whitewash, as you can tell, a terrible name, was basically the bottom of the barrel. The Young Allies were a group of bumbling sidekicks who helped Bucky out, and Whitewash was basically their sidekick. He would often be depicted as being low intelligence, terribly drawn half the time, and usually causing more trouble than he was worth, often getting into trouble, like making loud noises when they were supposed to be hiding. It's as bad as it sounds, and looking back at those old comics, they have definitely not aged well in any form. Moving on from there, we have what's considered the first black hero character. In this is one of those situations where there's a lack of consensus as to who's considered the first hero. So usually you get it being depicted as Lobo, who was a black cowboy existing in his own comic. Also, there's arguments for Ace Harlem and Voodoo. Voodoo is considered pretty much the earliest, but as we'll be seeing shortly, there's problems behind that character, and whether or not he can be truly seen as the first black hero character is very much up for debate. As for the first black superhero character, we can look to the more familiar character of the Black Panther, introduced in 1966 in an issue of Fantastic Four. We'll get more into details with Black Panther later, so I'll get back to that. Next up, we have what's considered the first black superhero comic, and that would be Luke Cage, Hero for Hire. Again, we'll be going into Luke's history in a bit later, so we'll get back to him. And then finally, in the first appearances, we have the first black hero to regularly start in a headliner series. A headliner series is basically a term used to comics, which, as you imagine, are the more famous ones. They're your Captain Americas, your Batmans, your Supermans, and your Spider-Mans. Falcon was introduced in Captain America as one of his assistants, and he's essentially gone on to himself to become Captain America since. So, let's get started. So we're going to start off with the 1930s here. And we're going to be looking at some of the initial artists. The first artist we're going to be looking at is Matt Baker. Matt Baker is generally known to be the first employed comic book black artist. There's possibly people before him, but as with many industries, the comic industry had a tendency not to credit a lot of people. So Matt Baker is known to be the first. There may have been others before him, but I was unable to find them. So Matt Baker, as an artist, was basically known for good girl art. So good girl comics were comics depicting the kind of adventurous hijinks of female characters. So in particular, you had ones like Canteen Kate, the South Sea Girl, Tiger Girl. These would often just basically show them in more comedy situations, similar to romantic sitcoms. So Canteen Kate here in particular is basically the adventures of a woman who lived on an army base and often got into plenty of trouble with the local troops. Matt Baker was the artist for comics like these, and he was generally known for creating grounded women. So he drew them realistically depicted, often with their own personality in their clothing, and generally had a good job of making them seem more realistic as compared to a lot more of the exaggerated superhero female characters that you'd often see with exaggerated proportions. He didn't necessarily not do that stuff. As you can see here, he redepicted the character of Phantom Lady in questionable garments, and yeah, he had a mix of different skills that went on from there. So he was also known for creating what was the first graphic novel. At the time, it would be considered a picture novel. He was the artist, alongside two other writers, Arnold Drake and Leslie Waller. The comic called It Rhymes with Lust. And this basically depicted just the comic, a kind of similar to a 1930s movie, the adventures of a man moving into a local town that's run by a crime syndicate, run by a woman who uses her seductive prowess to get her own way. Again, very much a 1930s style type storyline with women being depicted in certain ways. It is what it is. Matt Baker was also known for creating Voodoo, what's possibly considered the first black hero. He was very much a African tribal hero type character. Now, a lot of the comics being created during this time were creating it in a colonial manner. You would have the white man traveling to Africa and helping out the local populace. Often there would be people trying to take advantage of them. There would be local crime bosses, there would be like disputes with other tribes, and there would usually be a white man to come along and help fix their problems, usually, again, a product of its time, very negatively depicted. Vudar was initially seeming very different. Vudar himself was depicted as a black character who would essentially come and help fellow Africans in order to fix these problems. Unfortunately for the comic, it wasn't really depicted that way on the cover. What they would tend to do is, apparently this was to hedge their bets, as they would like use the excuse, newspaper stands. The comic would be presented with a white version of Vudar on the front cover with him being black on the inside. And even then, this wouldn't necessarily stay the way. After about issue 6, Vudar would be permanently coloured white in all issues, and he would just simply be depicted as a white man in all issues. So, although in a way he falls into the category of being a black character, he doesn't stay that way. He gets whitewashed, unfortunately. So, moving on from Matt Baker, we have another black artist in Jackie Orns. Jackie is considered the first black female writer and cartoonist. Focusing more on comic strips here rather than comic books, she was the creator of a character known as Torchy Brown and created comic strips in the 1930s. Jackie was definitely known for creating a strong fashion sense in her comics and apparently had a great career moving on from just simply being a proofreader and moving all the way up into being able to follow her passions as a cartoonist. The story of Torchy Brown followed the ongoing adventures of a young girl finding fame and fortune in the Cotton Club. The Cotton Club was a sort of problematic club that existed in New York at the time. It would feature black entertainers, but had an exclusively white clientele. So it created a bit of a dissonance in its existence. You would literally have, to a lot of black entertainers, this would be the only place they could find work. But the only people allowed to appreciate that work were the white people that were invited inside. Torchy's journey basically showed the plight of a lot of black Americans that were occurring at the time. With heavy segregation and discrimination occurring in the South of North America, a lot of them were traveling up north towards New York City, where they understood they would have a lot of an easier time there, where they understood there was a lot less discrimination going on. Unfortunately, as they got there, they discovered that there was still plenty of it. It was just not as bad as in the South. The strip had a strong focus on different areas. Jackie was more than willing to show off her fashion styles there and often would create fantastic dresses for her female characters. She was also more than happy to handle racism issues and environmental pollution at a time when these issues were essentially being kind of ignored and people were doing their best to keep them on the down low. Moving on from Jackie, we move on to the 1940s and we start to see examples of black people there essentially trying to find opportunities of creating comics themselves. And this resulted in the 1940s with the creation of All Negro Comics. All Negro Comics was the first comic written, drawn, and made completely by black people. It was spearheaded by Orrin C. Evans in 1947. Orrin C. Evans was a member of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. He was very vocal about his feelings on segregation in the armed services. Back during this time in America, you would literally have troops separated by white and black. White troops to one side, black troops to the other, with the black troops often being sent on a lot more dangerous missions or being used to research experiments. He spoke out against that in public and literally received death threats for daring to do so during a time of war. So during this time, he basically saw an opportunity to create a comic with purely black talent. He would get people who were skilled as writers and artists in this time and fully publish a comic for him to be sent throughout Philadelphia. It's unknown how far this particular comic got out into the general public. It's just a case of we don't really know, unfortunately, because we don't have proper statistics for it. But it's been collected and all that. It featured various characters. We have a few of them here. We have Lion Man, who's considered another jungle hero. We had Ace Harlem. Ace Harlem is probably the closest thing we have to a true first black hero. He was the first story in the comic. So that kind of puts him into that position. He was a black detective who helped fight crime in New York City. We also had smaller stories that were considered more for children. We had the Little Do-Dillies, which followed a group of fairy folk, which was very much a more innocent, comedic comic that was existing at the time. So unfortunately, All Negro Comics never got past the first issue. As once it got out there and it seemed to be having a small manner of success, it wasn't really allowed to grow, simply because the suppliers would not sell the paper required to print a second issue to Oren. It was simply stopped at that time. Moving on from the 1940s, we move on to a particular comic which was a sign of how things were being presented back then. During the 1950s, the Comics Code Authority was very much in full swing in America. This was created in response to fears that comics were corrupting America's youth, for the fears of comics containing things like drug use, sex, violence, and the like. And there was this idea that, like, if they were regulated, this could be curbed. Unfortunately, as it went on, the Comics Code Authority, in a way, overstepped their own boundaries to the point where they would heavily criticize any comic that went against what was considered normal American values. And in a particular example here that I'm about to show you, let's see if you can spot where they might view the problem. So this is Judgment Day, which was released in 1956 in Incredible Science Fiction. And it shows the story of a robotic alien race trying to be accepted into the Great Galactic Republic. A spokesperson comes down from the Great Galactic Republic with the intent of assessing them to see if they can enter the Great Republic. And as the assessor goes through the streets of this planet, he notices that there are both orange robots and blue robots. And he notices that the orange robots seem to live on the north side of the city, and the blue robots live on the south side of the city. You can probably already guess where this is going. He notices that the orange robots seem to have more liberties. The blue robots are made to sit at the back of the bus. Eventually, insisting on knowing more, he gets taken to the factories where the robots are made. And he discovers that the orange robots and the blue robots are basically built exactly the same. There's no like improvements, no differences, no disadvantages for the blue robots. Orange and blue are exactly alike. It's only the outside covering that makes them different. Eventually, after finishing his assessment of them, he sees that although they're technically advanced enough to join the Great Galactic Republic, their bigotry is preventing them from coming in. You can probably guess the twist of this story here at the end, that as he leaves, he has hope that one day the robots may learn to live together without segregation, and in doing so, he removes his helmet, revealing himself to be a black person. In a way, this is a simple allegorical tale, which at the time of its release did very well for itself. To look at the letters columns of Incredible Science Fiction afterwards, it received a lot of praise from its readers, who were more than happy to see this great representation happening, and wishing that comics would do more of this in the future. Unfortunately, at the time, they got a lot of flack from the Comics Code Authority, and there was an attempt made before its release to basically squash the entire story, simply because of the inclusion of a black man in a position of authority as the protagonist. The Comics Code Authority basically insisted that the protagonist be removed, even though that was kind of the whole point of the story. The twist of it being a black person implies that Earth in the far future will have abandoned discrimination and would no longer be full of bigots. And here we are with a bunch of bigots wanting to basically stop the story, even to the point where, accepting the black man, they wanted to remove the sweat on his face because it looked like twinkling stars in the final shot. And that apparently irked some people in the Comics Code Authority. You can only guess why. It's very, very dumb in its own way. So yeah, we can kind of see that in the 1950s, we had this trend that was going on where, although there was an attempt at having more black people in more positive roles, there was a lot of attempts at stopping it as well, unfortunately. From the 1950s, we move on to the 1960s, and the 1960s is when it gets a bit better for people. The 1960s is what's known as the Silver Age. This is Stan Lee's era. So this is the era where we had characters like Spider-Man, the Incredible Hulk, the Fantastic Four, the X-Men, all starting to come in and kind of changing how comics were seen at the time. And Stan Lee's kind of comic boom here, he began to realize an opportunity. He found it very difficult as a writer and editor, even in a position of like the chief editor at Marvel. He found it difficult to have black characters in starring roles. But what he saw was a possibility, was having black characters in supporting roles where they were westernized and non-stereotyped. So he would get rid of the dumb, strong group stereotype. He would start getting rid of like the comedy black character stereotype. And he would start pushing for supporting roles where they were more grounded, more realistic. And this resulted in a bevy of supporting characters, which some are still around today. We had, for example, Jackie Johnson. Jackie Johnson is a character from it's a DC comic, not a Marvel comic, but he was from a comic called Easy Company, from a comic called Army at War. And Easy Company was basically a bunch of ne'er-do-wells who fought in the military and got involved in various like army antics, usually fighting against some unknown forces. Jackie Johnson was a member of these troops, and what stands out about Jackie is simply enough, he's a normal guy. He's not the big strong guy, he's not the comedy guy, he is just simply one of the troops. And it was this normalization within his role in the comic which makes him stand out. The simple fact that there's nothing particularly special about him. He has a fantastic little comic which he's kind of famous for, known as like the Unarmed Gunner, where him and another member of Easy Company are basically have to work together. The man with the beard that you can see in the image here doesn't have his hands get injured, Jackie's eyes get injured, and they have to work together to man a gun in order to defend themselves. Another character still very prominent today was the character of Joseph Robbie Robinson, the city editor at the Daily Bugle. Robbie's a fantastic example of a grounded black character who's persisted to this day. He was the more balanced, and nicer character in comparison to J. Jonah Jameson. Anyone who's familiar with the Spider-Man comics will know J. Jonah Jameson. He's the guy who runs the Daily Bugle and always wants to get pictures of Spider-Man who being up to no good. He's played by J.K. Simmons in the movies. And Robbie was the counter to him, whereas J. Jonah Jameson would be full of rage. Robbie Robinson was the guy who would basically cut Peter the checks, who would always look at things more fairly. And he's been a very strong character all this time. Another character that's shown up was Hobie Brown, the Prowler. Hobie was made to kind of reflect Peter Parker as Spider-Man and during the 1960s, and he would be a sort of anti-hero character. He would have a similar set of circumstances to Peter Parker, but being black, he had a lot of problems. He would be a great inventor, but he would never be able to be hired as an inventor and would have to work as a window washer. And eventually he came up with the idea of dressing up as the Prowler to commit crimes, which his civilian identity, Hobie Brown, would solve. It didn't work out for him because Spider-Man would get involved, but Hobie would essentially turn over a new leaf and use the power of the Prowler in order to help fight crime rather than create it. The character of Robbie and his son Randy Robinson would also be used to help address a growing issue that was happening in New York in the 1960s. The growing crime rates that were happening in Harlem, in the north of New York City, was a big concern for a lot of people in New York, as well as the rampant drug use that was occurring during that time. Stan Lee wrote a series of comics during this which tried to kind of make it clear that the drug problem that was happening wasn't simply a black problem, it was an everyone problem, and that only by all New Yorkers getting together could they help solve it. He did this in an issue where he had the character of Harry Osborn, Peter Parker's best friend, becoming addicted to LSD and it tearing his life apart. And although Harry was basically a rich white kid, he was suffering from it the same as anyone else. And Randy and Robert, between them, basically would work together to help bring awareness to the growing drugs problem that was existing at the time. The 1960s also brought forth one of the more popular characters that we all generally know, the Black Panther, T'Challa, the King of Wakanda. Black Panther was introduced by Jack Kirby, the artist, at a time when he really wanted to see more black characters showing up in strips alongside Stan Lee. And the Black Panther was brought about in the issue of Fantastic Four as a sort of reverse to a lot of stories that were recurring during this time. As I mentioned beforehand, we had the tribal stories where colonial whites would travel to Africa to basically show them how it's done. This issue of this issue of Fantastic Four with Black Panther included in it kind of reversed that. In this issue, the Black Panther invites the Fantastic Four to come to Wakanda. And during that time, he basically sets a series of traps for them. They arrive and find it like the jungle to actually be a technological marvel far beyond what they see in America. And the Black Panther ends up fighting and defeating the Fantastic Four in a series of trials, showing that, essentially kind of like showing the equal footing that black people and white people could be seen on. The only reason the Fantastic Four were able to overcome him were a side character helping them out. It kind of helped pave the way within comic book stories of showing that black characters could be included in more positive roles. From the 1960s, we move on to the 1970s. The 1970s was very much the era of blaxploitation. It was becoming to realize within America that there was a possibility of aiming media at the urban African American audience that was on the growth there. And comics were no exception of this. There were plenty of movies and TV shows and the like, and comics were trying to get involved in this as well, seeing plenty of opportunity. This is the time that you see characters like Luke Cage coming into being, as well as Black Lightning and Bronze Tiger and the like. These stories would definitely have a focus which people believed would be more appealing to black audiences. Whether or not that was the case or not was to be seen. As Chinese martial arts films are becoming more popular, they were having characters be skilled in those martial arts. You would often find characters coming from Harlem, or essentially the north of New York, or just basically born in the ghettos of America. There would be a heavy political focus. Often one of the most common storylines that were occurring during these times would essentially be issues with black people against black people. You would have a black person who would get himself educated and move into the white person's world, entering places like becoming teachers or politicians and the like, and he would be seen as a race traitor of sorts for moving away from the ghetto and essentially improving himself, and the conflicts that would kind of occur in those issues. One of the big problems that often happened here is there would be a default of criminality in these comics. Characters like Luke Cage and the Falcon being introduced in this were often shown to be in a criminal position right from the start. Luke Cage's first issue has him being already in prison for a crime that he didn't commit, but he was thrown in jail regardless. And he essentially gets involved in a research experiment in there, which gives him his unbreakable skin. The Falcon, on the flip side, wasn't initially introduced as a criminal. He was introduced in an issue of Captain America, where Captain America meets him on an island and the two help each other escape. But later on, when they're doing the Falcon's origin story, he is very much depicted as a hustler. He basically arrives in LA and just immediately turns to crime, which was completely counter to how the character was being depicted at the time. He was always shown as a noble, selfless character. And here he is, apparently in his past, as soon as he enters America, it's straight to crime. It's unfortunately just how things were depicted back then. During this time, we had the guy who's he's considered the first comic book artist. I know earlier I said Jackie was the first comic strip artist. It's one of these distinctions that people like to make when they're talking about these things. Billy was very much considered not only the first black comic book artist, but he also, sorry, not the first comic book artist, the first black comic book writer. But he started his role as an inker, simply drawing in the black ink on the pencil works of somebody else. But Billy was skilled, and he generally had a personality that everyone grew to love. So as he goes through his career, he's able to move from being an inker to a penciler. And as the penciler, he was able to make himself a writer sort of on the side. The Marvel comics, as they released then, were using what was called the Marvel method, which would basically have the writer write an initial outline in the comic, and then that would be passed over to the penciler. The penciler would go ahead and create a full story using just that storyline being given, literally making blank boards with speech bubbles. It would then get inked, and then it would go back to the writer, who would then use those boxes in order to make a story. Billy kind of turned this on its head, because as he received them as a penciler, he would basically fill in the speech bubbles himself, creating, especially with the black characters, writing in what he would actually think they would say, basically being a little creative here and there. And his work was good, and there was no reason to get rid of it. So it became quite clear that, he should be moved into a higher position. And it's always good to read Luke Cage Hero for Hire itself, because you see his growth going through there. He literally starts off in the first few issues as an inker. He then moves on to a penciler. He then becomes a co-collaborator and moves from a co-collaborator to a co-writer until eventually he reaches the position of writer within the comic, all within the space of about 2 years. So Billy was definitely known for creating both grounded characters. His characters would essentially be realistically depicted, again, moving away from the dumb brute characters or the comedy sidekick characters. But he was also known for having a strong energy in his comic. We can see here some pictures of Luke Cage and Black Panther, and we can kind of see an energy coming from their poses. A lot of people loved his work at the time, and unfortunately he would pass away early and not be able to kind of continue into the modern day, but he was definitely appreciated for his time. The 1970s also brought about an interesting little occurrence which seemed to happen during that time. You may have noticed earlier when I was going through first appearances, I didn't mention any black women, and that's because I wanted to bring it around here. So 1975 brought about an interesting little thing. It's always hard to say. You have to remember the Marvel and DC comics, as well as many other comics, were all being created in New York. So there was very much a melting pot of comic creators happening here. And it seems that something clearly happened around 1975 in the early months, because all of a sudden, before here, we didn't really have any like black hero women that were occurring. And suddenly in 1975, we have a whole bunch of them. The one that's usually cited is Storm of the X-Men, the black mutant who had the ability to control the weather. It's always fun to go onto her Wikipedia page because you'll often see it written that people will claim her to be the first black female hero in comic books. And it's immediately followed by a line clearly written by somebody else who insists that isn't the case, and he points out that there are a bunch of other heroes. Because a few months before then, we actually had the character of Bumblebee introduced in DC Comics. Before then, we had Nubia, the fraternal sister of Wonder Woman. Before her, we had Misty Knight, the female detective with a bionic arm. All of these characters would come about in 1975, and it's worth mentioning the way comics were being created at the time. They weren't really, it's not like people would have seen one and then suddenly like rushed on the trend. These would have all been created a few months before their release. So Storm would have been created before anyone would have seen Misty Knight or Bumblebee. And again, something very clearly happened at some point which inspired the creation of these characters. These are pretty much considered by many people to be the first hero characters of the first black women hero characters of comic books. The definitions get more and more precise as we go on. They're actually all wrong, of course. The first black female hero character would have been the Butterfly, introduced in 1971 in Atomic Comics. She was a kind of detective character who would guard herself up as a butterfly in order to scare her enemies, a la Batman. She was introduced for a small time, she had a very small run and was almost completely forgotten about. So she usually doesn't get mentioned in things like this, but yeah, in a way, she's introduced as the first black female hero character. From here, we move on to the 1980s. How am I doing for time? Oh, I'm doing okay. The 1980s, I want to take the opportunity to talk about Black Lightning. Black Lightning is considered DC's first black superhero character. He was actually created in the 1970s, but he basically gets one appearance there. And yeah, basically from that point on, he started as a guest star. He didn't really come into his own until the 1980s, so I'm going to start including him here. Black Lightning was a guy called Jefferson Pierce, who, as part of his secret identity, would fight crime both in his hero form and in his civilian garb, usually focusing on preventing drugs and gang warfare. He initially started working as a teacher in a school that was very much being essentially cut off from everywhere else. And so gangs and crime were allowed to run rampant there, and he fought them both in his civilian identity and as a hero. And Black Lightning was probably a good, clear example of a trend which we've been seeing since the start of all this, in that he's a black character being written by white creators, although there may be black artists, they're being primarily created by white writers. And Black Lightning was created by Tony Isabella, and when he first came to the character, he basically found DC were in the process of creating their first black superhero. And in doing so, they had come up with the idea of the Black Bomber. The Black Bomber would be depicted as a white racist in his civilian identity, who would turn into a black person after being exposed to a chemical formula under stress. So he would basically be kind of a version of the Hulk, literally turning into a big black strongman as soon as he got too angry about some racist issue. It's as stupid as it sounds, and fortunately, before it even got into publication, that's when Tony Isabella stepped in and basically said, "This is dumb, don't do this." And he was able to get the character completely thrown out and replaced with Black Lightning, which was very fortunate at the time. But even with this, there was still potential little issues with the character. In a way, it's very similar to my own issue doing this presentation. I'm a white person talking about black history. There's going to be plenty of cultural nuances that I am missing, terms which I'll be using incorrectly because I've just not been brought up in that particular area. And Tony Isabella had a similar thing here with Black Lightning. You can see here in this image, we have Jefferson Pierce removing his mask, and you see that the afro comes with it. So the afro is actually part of the mask. Now, in the 1970s in particular, the afro was very much being used as a sign of black identity. A black individual would show their personal identity by having an afro, and it was a very important part to them to do that. So being able to simply take it off, from my understanding and what I've seen people suggest in that, is kind of weird in itself, but it would have gone completely unnoticed by a lot of the people reading this. The black people reading this would no doubt have seen it and thought, that's kind of odd. But the white people reading it would have been completely blank to it, unless told otherwise. And yeah, it would have been part of the trends that were occurring back then. There would have been other characters doing similar things, which just didn't quite work out that way. So what was clearly needed during this time was more black writers who were more familiar with it. And that's a pretty much good segue to move. Oh, wait, no, I missed a bit. Another thing, I'll just cover this bit quickly. Another bit that was happening in another thing with the creation of Black Lightning that would occur would be the strange trend that would happen with a lot of black characters, in that a lot of them would be depicted with lightning or electric powers. This was a strange particular trend that seemed to occur. We would have characters such as Storm or Black Lightning being the most obvious ones, ability to generate electricity, but you'd even have characters like Cyborg, who, being like depicted as mostly robot, would usually be shown as having like electrical highlights or using guns that fired electric blasts. But you'd even have characters like Bumblebee, who was initially depicted as having mechanical wings, would eventually get electric wings. And this proceeds to this day, with even like more modern day black characters being created with electricity or lightning within their power set. There's no clear reason why this has occurred, but lots of speculation has occurred about it. The most commonly cited cases that I've heard is that it's simply because Black Lightning and Storm came first. That's probably the most likely reason. Simply enough, it's a case of they had lightning powers, so a lot of people would have jumped off of that trend and also given their characters lightning powers. We'll see a lot of similar trends happening a bit in the future. Another reason that I found often being given is the idea of it simply worked as a good artistic contract. People with black skin, again, you have to understand comics were being drawn initially without color. So they would draw essentially the pencils, the inks, and then only afterwards would they be colored. So a lot of the art was being depicted from a black and white focus. And black skin with white lightning on it made a very interesting artistic contrast, which has been argued to be one of the reasons why it has occurred. I can't say whether that's the case or not. There's no clear, there's not like there was any clear discussion or reason why this would have built up during the time. It's just how it happened. Getting to the point I actually wanted to make earlier, we now move to the 1990s, and probably one of the best known black writers of them all, Dwayne McDuffie. Dwayne was a fantastic guy. I could do an entire presentation on this guy himself, although I found I basically didn't have to. There's a documentary called Rob Kirkman's Secret World of Comics, which follows the creation of Milestone Media, which Dwayne McDuffie was at the head of. And Milestone Media was a group of African Americans who basically went on to create their own series of comics under the DC label and got it published through them. And it's one of the more well-known creations of black comic characters. Dwayne didn't hesitate to focus on diversity and discrimination. He was more than willing to fight it head on. And a lot of the comics that he created would often be criticizing or referencing issues that were occurring during the time. He created comics like Damage Control, which was one of his first, which was basically, as it says, an office workplace comedy about a group specializing in rebuilding after superhero fights. These would be the people who would clear up the giant robots after they've crashed into the Empire State Building. Very much more of a comedy focus on that, but it had a collection of black characters that Dwayne made a point of including in. He also created the character of Deathlock. Deathlock was created in critique to the grim and gritty style that was happening in the 90s. This was the time of characters like Cable and Deadpool, where it was all guns, violence. And now that the Comics Code Authority had basically been abandoned, people were more than willing to create these very negative characters and just have them cause problems. Dwayne created Deathlock to critique a lot of what was going on about this. Deathlock is the story of a pacifist called Michael Collins who was trapped inside the body of a cybernetic killing machine. And Michael Collins basically has to find a way to overcome his condition, find the people who did this to him in a suit that's basically telling him to kill and murder all the time. He was more, during comic runs like this, Dwayne was more than willing to refer to the works of black philosophers such as Du Bois, more than willing to include political messages that were occurring back then. He often would try to include as much diversity as possible and would hit roadblocks as a result of it. One of his common quotes here is about the problem of having more than 2 black characters in a piece of media before it starts to be seen as a black story, something which he would completely disagree against and would often push to prevent. So in things like during this time, superhero cartoons were coming into a lot more focus, and during the Justice League cartoon, they pushed for the black Green Lantern John Stewart to be used instead of Hal Jordan, the white Green Lantern Hal Jordan. He would have one of his creations was Static Shock, who was one of the more popularly known ones, and he would focus directly on racism. Static Shock's best friend would have a father who was a racist, and they would literally confront that in various comics and within the cartoon itself. One of the most memorable things that Dwayne was known for doing was critiquing the influx of black basketball playing skateboarding teenagers. During the 90s, there was a significant increase in characters which seemed to have been based off Will Smith, who was becoming popular at the time with The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. And these characters would be, as I've said, always playing basketball, always riding their skateboards, always talking in a hip way. And so Dwayne wrote a letter to the editors of Marvel. He was working at Marvel at the time, so it went straight to them, to basically suggest the formation of a new group known as the Teenage Negro Ninja Thrashers. And this would be a group of people primarily insisting on black people riding skateboards, including their mysterious black leader, who would also ride a skateboard. And they would have a white friend who would help them with their electronic stuff, and a white female friend who would help them calm down when they got too angry. And yeah, it was very much done as the flat-out satire and critique what was happening in a few of the comics during this time. And the message was made clear. Marvel's top editors realized what was going on, and they told Dwayne that they would do better, and they would try to improve from that point forwards. Whether or not they did is up to history, but we can actually start to see it happen as we moved into the 2000s. The 2000s was very much a period of what I see as comic book reform, fixing the past. Basically creating new stories that sort of rectify a lot of the previous stereotypes. It was during this time because this was the age where the internet was coming up, people were beginning to get more aware of the old negatively depicted black comics, in particular things like the Young Allies and depictions like Whitewash Jones that we saw at the beginning. And one of the comics that was released during this time was the Sentinels of Liberty, which was basically a retelling of the Young Allies comic that was released in the 1940s. If you've forgotten the beginning of this letter already, this was the depiction of Bucky's psychic group of characters who were usually depicted as buffoons, with Whitewash Jones being at the bottom of the pile, pretty much. This was rewritten at the time, so instead of being a group of kids, they're actually a group of secret agents, with the Young Allies comic itself being seen as in-universe propaganda. So this was a comic literally being sold within the Marvel universes itself in the time, which depicted them instead as children with varying comical depictions. So Whitewash himself was revealed to actually be Washington Jones, a skilled pilot who was the group's vehicle guy, often being able to more than capable of handling himself. He looks back, we see the depiction of the Sentinels of Liberty from a current day perspective, with them reminiscing about the past and how it actually went. So we see the older version of Washington Jones here in the top and his younger soldier self at the bottom. He had mixed opinions on his own depiction, with the idea being a case of he found it partially funny, he found it very offensive at the same time, and he also could see where it happened. As he quotes here, you could see those writers had never been uptown, referring to the borough of New York known as Harlem. Again, this was a comic created to literally confront what had happened in the time. It's kind of up to your own interpretation how you want to view this, I guess. So it's a case of, I think the main intent here is to not simply remove the past and say it never actually happened like that. It's more, let's not forget how history went, but let's still be able to refer to it and talk about it. Another comic that was released during this time was known as Truth, Red, White, and Black, which starred what was known as the first Captain America. This followed in the footsteps of what Orrin C. Evans was often talking about in his fights against segregation within the troops. At the time, American troops were being separated into white troops and black troops, with the black troops being sent on the more dangerous missions and being subjected to research experiments. Truth, Whether Right and Black basically covered this head on in a mirror to the, if I can say it right, the Tuskegee syphilis experiments that were occurring at the time. Now, this was literally, they were getting black troops in the 1930s and up until the 1950s, and they were injecting them with syphilis in order to trace how the virus would spread through their systems and like you use that for medical purposes. So obviously a horrible thing to do, and this story here basically mirrored that in order to help bring light to it, taking the super soldier forum that gave Steve Rogers, the original Captain America, his superhuman strength, and showing that before it was given to him, it was tested on a bunch of other people, namely black troops. The story basically follows a group of black troops, goes through their personal histories, and shows how the the kind of prototype version of the super soldier serum changed them in various ways. Some it flat out killed, some it heavily deformed, hence this image of certain troops here. With only a few of them it actually worked, granting them the same super strength that Captain America would have. And Isaiah Bradley would end up being the only survivor of this group and would escape from his captors and go on to wear his own version of the Captain America garb after Steve Rogers had started to show up in order to mirror him and fight against the Nazis his own way. At one point, he's literally able to punch Hitler in the face after he's temporarily captured by them, as we can kind of see in the prelude to this image here. Again, the idea was to bring forth like terrible things that had occurred in the past and bring them to light, make people aware of them. And that's what this comic essentially aimed to do. From here, we move into the 2010, and we're kind of coming to the end of the story here of where we are with comics. But one particular new thing that was starting to happen showed up here. So most comics that were being created at the time involving black characters were created usually to follow a particular trend, as we've seen. Usually it could have been like the negative racist depictions of black people in the early 30s. It could have been the attempt to it could have been an attempt for political awareness that we saw in the 1960s, or following other particular trends that were occurring in media, as with the blaxploitation in the Will Smith area. What wasn't happening for a lot of cases was black characters being created for individual purposes, like with individuals in mind. And the 2010s is where we started to see a change to that, in particular with two characters, Miles Morales, the Ultimate Spider-Man, and Moon Girl and Devil Dinosaur. These were characters that were created with their personalities coming through first. Miles was created as just a regular kid living in New York facing his own problems. His creators made a point of trying to work with him and make him a believable character rather than a larger than life character. So Miles gets worried about things. He's really interested in in other things. He's really into his tech. But at the same time, again, he gets nervous around girls and the like. And he was generally created as being a more normal character. Luella, which is a comic I absolutely love, came about as Moon Girl, and she's basically an eccentric preteen girl who is all about her gadgets. She loves building stuff, and she sees herself as an insanely smart person and proves it in many different occasions. I heavily recommend both of these comics. I'll be doing a bit of recommendations thing right at the end here, and we are definitely coming up to near the end, so I'll very quickly move on. We'll move on now to the 2020s, and this is our current era. This is where we are at the moment. So I'd like to kind of take this moment to look at not only what's come before, but what's also kind of coming afterwards. So with coming before, we kind of see a few legacy things. And one of the things that kind of came out in recent years was a new Mandrake the Magician. Mandrake, if you remember, was the character I mentioned early in the 1930s, and a new version has been brought out to kind of essentially bring light to the character again. And Mandrake is succeeded by his niece, and she has her best friend, LJ, become her assistant. LJ is a fun little character to read. He's basically the guy who talks sense into Mandrake whenever she gets a bit too eccentric with what she's doing. We also found Lothar himself returning, basically working as a father figure, providing advice to his son. He's still depicted as strong and clumsy, but the dumb, brute, exotic jungle man version of his persona has been removed. So this, again, it's the idea that now we're trying to actually make more grounded characters out of characters that have come before. And in a similar line of legacy, we also have a legacy of Matt Baker's. So it was basically determined during interviews with his friends. Matt Baker himself actually passed away at an early age. And basically, it was determined that Matt Baker was gay through interviews with his friends, but being a gay black man in the 1930s, you can imagine, came with a whole set of problems, so he generally kept it hidden. It's only through interviews that it's become a bit well known. And in 2022, Marvel decided to honor Matt Baker's memory by dedicating the LGBTQIA+ youth center that existed within the Marvel universe in his name. So it's now known as the Matt Baker House. So as comics have kind of like continued to grow, we're now seeing more gay characters, more trans characters being included in comic books. And the Matt Baker House is basically their youth center where a bunch of them can come with all their different superpowers and basically talk. And the place exists in his name. With the legacy that we have, we also have the future of comics. And in a way, we're in a great age now for black comic books because this is the age of the internet. And so anyone with a pen, paper, digital tablet, a set of ideas and access to the internet can go ahead and create their own stories. And with that, we have what I tend to call as the comic book explosion, where we simply have loads of them now, and it's great. We've got comics like Substitute, Hover Girls, Clock Striker. Clock Striker in particular is a nice little great one. That's made by a lady who lives in Niger in Africa. I've not had time to talk about African comics here. I would have loved to have done so, but that's a whole blossoming industry in itself. But we're basically seeing loads of these comics being created. We're getting webcomics, webtoons. Webtoon comics are ones that exist to be viewed on your mobile phone, so you can scroll up easy. You got indie comics, manga comics, social media comics. These are comics that literally only exist on social media websites, so they're not even being published in the main way. And there are just plenty of black creators out there making these comics. So we've gone from just a handful of people barely struggling to get any kind of recognition to the point where now people can just create their stories whenever they want. So yeah, that's how it's gone. So just a quick little bit here. I'll go into the Q&A in a second and see if anyone's asked any questions. I can't see the Q&A screen at the moment, so for all I know, there's none. If you want to get more into this stuff, if you've got no idea where to start, there's a whole bunch of places where you can find stuff. I'll be having a EDI blog entry coming up, which will have a whole list of different resources on it. So, but before then, one of the best sites for the older stuff is Comic Book Plus. There's plenty of these comics that are now free because they've either passed public domain or their companies have just flat out folded. If you want to read all Negro comics or Crown comics, which involve voodoo, they're on here. So if you want to see more of the Marvel and comic stuff, that pretty much has to be bought on market and auction sites. There's also the Comixology app. You can basically usually find them by simply typing in things like Classic Luke Cage, or they use terms like the Essentials range or the Showcase range for a lot of these characters. So if you search on those terms with those characters' names, you'll usually find their old stuff. If you want a very interesting read, there's a place called the Comics Republic, which handles African superheroes. And there's a whole bunch of free comics there made by a lot of indie artists. So yeah, I recommend checking all of them out. So yeah, thank you for your time.